One October night, a pale young man walked into a small cafe, saying he hadn't been outside for 9 years. From that moment, a strange silence began to unravel. How could an entire family vanish in the middle of a peaceful town without a single person noticing? What was hidden inside the old farmhouse at the edge of Ruinerwold? It was a calm evening in early October 2019 in the small Dutch village of Ruinerwold. A place surrounded by flat fields, slow rivers, and rows of quiet houses where life rarely changed. The kind of village where people greeted each other by name, where a new face was something to talk about for a week. In the middle of it stood a cafe called De Kastelein, a warm place with old wood tables, yellow lights, and the smell of coffee and beer mixed in the air. That night, the cafe was almost empty when a young man walked in. He looked strange from the moment the door opened. He was thin, his hair uneven, his clothes too large and worn, as if they had been washed by hand for many years. He didn't look like a traveler or a farmhand. He looked like someone who had just stepped out of another world. He walked up to the counter and said, in a quiet voice, that he wanted 5 beers. The owner, Chris Westerbeek, thought he had misheard, but the young man repeated it, this time looking straight at him with tired, restless eyes. Chris poured the beers and watched as the young man drank them one after another, without pause, as though trying to calm something deep inside. The cafe was silent except for the sound of the glasses touching the wooden bar. Chris noticed that the man seemed uneasy. He flinched at sudden noises, looked at the windows as if he was afraid of what was outside. When Chris tried to ask where he was from, the man hesitated, rubbed his hands together and said softly, "I can't go back." Chris asked, "Back where?" The man looked down. His voice was unsteady when he answered, "I've been inside for 9 years." At first, Chris didn't understand. Inside what? A hospital? A prison? The man didn't explain. He said only that he had lived on a farm nearby with his brothers and a sister. He said he was the oldest, and that he wanted to end the way they lived. His words came out slowly, like someone trying to remember how to speak. Chris saw that his eyes were red from crying, and his hands trembled as he held the glass. Chris could tell this was not a drunk man telling a wild story. There was fear in his face. Deep, real fear. He offered him some food, but the man shook his head. He said he didn't have any money, then added something that made Chris pause. "Money doesn't matter where I live." Outside, the rain began to fall. The young man seemed afraid to leave. He sat quietly until the cafe closed. Chris felt uneasy, torn between sympathy and alarm. Before locking up, he decided to call the police. When officers arrived, the man told them his name was Jan, that he was 25 years old, and that he had walked from a farm a few kilometers away on Buitenhoutserweg. He told them he had no ID card, no address, and had never gone to school. He said there were 6 others living with him, all family. They had been waiting, he said, for the end of days. His father believed the world outside was evil. For 9 years they had not spoken to anyone, had not seen anyone. The officers looked at each other, unsure what to think. His story sounded impossible. Still, they saw his clothes were old, his shoes caked with mud, his face pale. His words were quiet but certain. So they noted the location and told him to wait while they checked the farmhouse he described. The road to Buitenhoutserweg was narrow, lined with tall trees that blocked the view. When the police car turned onto it, the rain had stopped, and the mist hung low over the fields. The farmhouse stood in the distance, an old, heavy structure of brick and timber, half hidden behind hedges and a wooden gate. The grass was tall. The windows were dark. From far away, it looked abandoned, the kind of place one might pass without a second glance. But the mailbox held recent letters. There was a bicycle leaning against the wall, and faint light glowed from one corner of the house, the kind that could come from a small lamp, not electricity. The officers called out. No answer. They knocked, louder. Still silence. One of them walked around the side of the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Near the back, they found a small garden patch. There were signs of life. Fresh soil, small rows of vegetables, a bucket half full of water. Whoever lived here had worked the ground recently. The officers exchanged looks. This was not an empty place. They tried the front door again. Locked. Then one officer noticed a narrow side door, old but recently oiled, leading into what looked like a storage area. He tested the handle. It turned easily. From inside came a faint smell of dust and damp wood. The officers shined their lights in, calling out once more. No reply, only the echo of their own voices. Somewhere deeper inside, something creaked. The sound was small, like a footstep, or a door shifting with air. The officers froze, listening. One of them called out in Dutch, "Police, is anyone there?" Silence followed. Then another soft noise, this time below them, like movement under the floor. They stepped farther into the dark hallway. The air was still, heavy. There were tools on the wall, shoes by the door, a few dishes left to dry on a rack. Nothing chaotic, nothing broken. It looked like someone had been living there, but hiding the evidence of it. One of the officers pointed to a rug in the corner that didn't lie flat. When he lifted it, he saw a square hatch with a wooden handle. It wasn't locked, just covered. A faint draft came through the gap, carrying the smell of earth and something else, stale, like air that hadn't moved in years. The officers stood, quietly for a long moment, their lights steady on the hatch. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. Finally, the senior officer nodded. "Let's open it," he said. That was the moment the hidden years of the Ruinervold family began to come to light. When the officer pulled the wooden hatch open, a breath of cold air rose from below. It smelled of soil, oil, and something damp, like an old cellar that hadn't been touched for years. A narrow stairway led down into darkness. The light from their flashlights showed the rough edges of stone walls, a few wooden beams, and the glint of metal pipes. One of the officers called out again, "Police! Is anyone down there?" The only answer was silence. The sound of their own breathing filled the space. Step by step they went down. The floor creaked under their boots. At the bottom, the beam of the flashlight found a small room no bigger than a storage shed. The air was thick and still, and the walls were covered with blankets instead of wallpaper, maybe to keep the warmth in or the noise out. In the corner stood a small table with a few cups and plates, and beside it, a candle that had burned all the way down to its base. There was no window, only the hatch above. The officers looked around carefully. The room wasn't empty. There were beds, 6 of them, made of wood, covered with thin gray blankets. And on those beds, there were people. They didn't move at first. The light startled them. One by one they lifted their heads, their eyes narrow and unsteady against the brightness. They were young. Too young to be the adults they claimed to be later. Pale faces, long hair, and eyes that didn't seem to know what to look at. They watched the officers as if they were seeing strangers for the first time. One of them whispered something to another, a language that sounded like Dutch, but quieter, slower, as if they had forgotten how to speak it. The officers spoke softly, trying not to scare them. "It's all right. We're here to help. How many of you are here?" A boy, maybe 15 or 16, shook his head and said, "We are 6, and Father is upstairs." His voice cracked when he said the last word. The officers exchanged looks. There had been no sign of anyone upstairs. They asked for names. The children hesitated. They gave first names only. Jan, though he was not there now, then B, A, and others whose names later changed in the reports to protect their identity. Each said they were adults, over 18. But their thin arms, the softness in their faces, told another story. On the table lay a Bible, open to a page that had been underlined so many times the words were fading. A notebook beside it held lines written in the same hand, tight and careful, each dated and marked, "Day of Waiting." There was food in jars, bread that had gone dry, and bottles of water lined up neatly on a shelf. It looked like a life, made from what little they had, but one that had been going on for a very long time. One officer stepped back and looked around the room again. "How long have you been here?" he asked. A girl answered, 9 years. Her voice was quiet, almost proud, as if it was a number she had learned by heart. They asked if they wanted to leave. No one answered. Some looked toward the ceiling, as if asking for permission from someone who wasn't there. Others stared at the floor. The officers decided to take them out one by one. As they climbed the stairs, the children shielded their eyes. The outside light from the flashlight was too strong for them. Upstairs, the house felt strange. Every room looked lived in, but not recently. There were dishes washed and stacked, but no fresh food. The furniture was simple and old. A radio sat on a shelf, unplugged, with dust covering it. Near the kitchen, the officers found another door, locked from the inside. They forced it open and found a man lying in bed, weak and still. His beard was long, his face thin. He opened his eyes slowly when the flashlight hit him. "Are you Gerrit Jan van Die?" one of them asked. The man nodded faintly. The room smelled of medicine and old cloth. There were jars with herbs, notes written in neat handwriting pinned to the wall, Bible verses, small reminders about prayer and silence. The man didn't speak much, only said that he had been called to this place and that his children were safe. His voice was calm, too calm, as if none of this was strange to him. The officers called for medical help immediately. Outside, the mist had thickened, wrapping the farm in a soft gray cover. The paramedics arrived quietly, careful not to alarm the children further. They carried them out, wrapped in blankets, into waiting vans. The villagers nearby began to gather behind the police line, whispering, trying to see through the fog. Word spread fast. "They found a family in a secret room," someone said. 9 years, they say. Hidden all this time." People couldn't believe it. In a small place like Runervold, where everyone knew everyone, how could a family disappear inside their own home without a single soul noticing? When the last of the children were taken away, an officer walked back to the house to make sure it was empty. He looked around once more. The small beds, the notebooks, the blankets, the candle wax hardened on the floor. On one wall, carved into the wood, were small marks, groups of lines, 6 at a time, as if someone had been counting the days. He stood there for a while, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the quiet of an empty house. It was the kind that comes after years of silence, thick and uneasy. He turned off his flashlight and climbed the stairs back into the cold air. The farm gate was left open that night. The lights of police cars reflected on the puddles in the dirt road. Inside the vehicles, 6 children sat wrapped in hospital blankets, staring through the windows at the world they hadn't seen in nearly a decade. None of them spoke. The only sound was the rain starting again, soft against the metal roof. Behind them, the farmhouse stood dark and still, its door swinging slightly with the wind. The lock had never been on the outside. The world had simply forgotten what was inside. By the time the story reached the national news, people across the Netherlands were already calling it the hidden family case. Yet in Ruinerwold itself, the questions were quieter, heavier. Everyone wanted to know who the man in the bed was, the one the police had carried out last. His name was Gerrit Jan van D., 67 years old, tall but frail, once a teacher, later a farmer, and finally, the head of a small world no one else knew existed. In the hospital, doctors said Gerrit had suffered a stroke some time earlier. His right side was partly paralyzed. When police tried to question him, his words came slowly, as if each one had to travel through thick fog. Still, he spoke with certainty. He said he had followed the will of God, that the world outside had fallen into sin, and that he had chosen to keep his children safe from it. When asked about their mother, he simply said, "She returned to the father," and nothing more. Investigators soon learned that Gerrit had not lived there alone. Records showed the farmhouse had been rented by another man, Joseph B., a 58-year-old handyman from Austria. People in nearby towns knew him as quiet, polite, and hard-working. He fixed fences, cut trees, repaired roofs, and asked few questions. To most, he seemed harmless. He had rented the Ruinerwold property under his own name and told neighbors that an older man lived there who preferred privacy. That was enough for a place like Ruinerwold, where people respected distance. For years, Joseph was the only one who left the farm regularly. He bought tools, groceries, and supplies in small amounts, just enough for 2, maybe 3 people. No one ever suspected there were 7 more hidden beneath the floor. The shopkeeper in Meppel remembered him coming in every few weeks, quiet but polite, paying in cash. Once, when asked if he wanted to register a customer card, he smiled and said, "No need. We live a simple life." Inside the farmhouse, Gerrit ruled everything. He had created his own system of faith, mixing parts of Christianity with his own visions. He told his children that the world outside was corrupted, that only their small family remained pure. He read the Bible to them every day, but also his own writings, long pages of thoughts about cleansing and waiting. He believed that when the end of days came, only those who had stayed apart from the world would be saved. The children obeyed. They worked the small garden behind the house, grew potatoes, carrots, and beans. They milked goats and kept chickens. They made soap, bread, and clothes. They lived without electricity most of the time, using oil lamps at night. Gerrit wrote their daily routines in notebooks: who prayed when, who tended to the animals, who copied verses by hand. When one of them became sick, he treated them with herbs and prayer. When they argued, he punished them with silence or fasting. To them, Gerrit was not just a father. He was the voice of truth, the one who knew everything. Over time, even the idea of the outside world became a story, not a place. Joseph visited often, staying for days at a time. He brought supplies, helped repair the roof, and fixed plumbing. The children knew him only as Uncle Joseph. To outsiders, he was the caretaker. To Gerrit, he was the gatekeeper, the one who ensured no one entered uninvited. Police later found that Joseph had installed cameras around the property, though they were not connected to the internet. He said it was for protection. Neighbors recalled small things that now felt strange in hindsight. One farmer said Joseph once asked to borrow a trailer, but insisted no one follow him to the property. Another said he delivered some wooden planks and was told to leave them at the gate. "I never saw anyone else there," the man said later. "It was always him, always polite, always alone." When the investigation deepened, police searched Joseph's rented house in Austria. There they found letters from Gerrit, long, careful writings filled with religious phrases and requests for supplies. Some letters spoke of purity and preparation. Others asked Joseph to keep the world away. It was clear that the two men shared the same belief, that the family's isolation was not a crime, but a mission. Detectives pieced together how it all began. Garrett had once been part of a small Christian sect decades earlier, known for its strict and unusual interpretations of faith. After a conflict with church leaders, he withdrew completely, moving his family to the countryside. His wife died soon after, and that seemed to push him further into obsession. One by one, he stopped registering his children's births, stopped paying taxes, stopped answering letters. To the government, the family simply disappeared. In the farmhouse, time lost meaning. Days were marked not by calendars but by prayers. The children were taught to fear outsiders, police, doctors, even neighbors. They believed that leaving the farm meant losing their souls. When they were little, they asked why no one visited. Garrett told them that the world had ended already, that only their family remained. But Jan, the eldest, had begun to doubt. He was a teenager when the isolation began, old enough to remember a bit of the outside world. Over the years, he tried to ask questions about school, about other people, but his father's answers never changed. Eventually, when Garrett fell ill and became too weak to control everything, Jan saw a chance. He waited until Joseph was away, took some money hidden in a jar, and walked for hours through the night until he reached the village. That small act, one step out of the gate, shattered the illusion that had held for nearly a decade. When police arrested Joseph a few days later, he said he had done nothing wrong. "I only helped," he told them. "They were safe there." Garrett, from his hospital bed, gave the same message. "We were chosen to be apart." But the children's faces told another story. They were thin, pale, and frightened of sunlight. Doctors found signs of neglect, though no major injuries. Psychologists said their fear of strangers was deep, almost like that of wild animals meeting people for the first time. They spoke in short sentences, avoided eye contact, and waited for permission before doing anything. The village that once prided itself on its quiet now found itself filled with reporters, police, and disbelief. Locals stood behind fences, shaking their heads, wondering how this could happen in their midst. One old man said softly, "The gate was always open. We just never looked in." As the investigation continued, more details came to light. Letters, receipts, old photos of Garrett smiling beside his wife before everything changed. But the deeper the police looked, the clearer it became that this was not just about a hidden family. It was about control, faith, and how a single man's belief can build walls stronger than any prison. And at the center of those walls stood Garrett Jan van D., the father who thought he was saving his children by hiding them from the world, and Joseph B., the man who kept the gate closed for him. Inside that small hidden room, life had followed its own slow rhythm. It was a world measured not by days or months, but by prayers and routines. Every morning began the same way. A bell sound, soft and steady, rung by their father before sunrise. The air inside the room was always heavy, smelling of damp wood, oil, and the vegetables they stored near the wall. There was no clock. There were no seasons. Only the sound of Garrett's voice reading from the Bible and the sound of their own breathing in between his words. He would read for hours, his voice sometimes calm, sometimes rising sharply when he spoke of purity and the chosen. After prayers, the children took turns working in the small garden outside, never beyond the fence. They dug soil, planted seeds, carried water in metal buckets. Garrett said the earth was their test, their proof of obedience. When they finished, they returned to the cellar, closing the hatch carefully so no one would hear. There was no school, but Garrett taught them himself. His lessons were mixed with religion and his own rules. He told them stories from the Bible, then rewrote them to fit his vision. "The world outside is lost," he said often. "God gave us this place so we can wait for his sign." The children copied verses by hand in old notebooks, filling page after page with the same lines until the ink faded. When they made mistakes, Garrett made them repeat the writing in silence. The oldest, Jan, remembered small pieces of another life: streets, laughter, a mother's voice. But as years passed, those memories blurred. He was not allowed to talk about them. Garrett called them tricks of the world. When Jan asked why they could not visit anyone, his father said, "Because the world no longer exists." The words sank deep, and the more he heard them, the more they sounded like truth. Each child had a duty. One cared for the goats, another cleaned, another watched over the younger ones. Food was plain: bread, potatoes, eggs, water. Once a week they were allowed a small piece of fruit as a reward for obedience. When someone disobeyed, spoke without asking, questioned, or cried, they were sent into silence. Garrett would close them in the smaller room beside the stairs and leave them there for a day, sometimes two, with only water. He said silence cleansed the spirit. There were no birthdays, no holidays. Garrett said those belonged to the fallen world. Instead, they had days of reflection, where everyone sat still for hours while he prayed aloud. On those days, even the younger ones learned not to move. They learned to disappear inside themselves. At night, the house grew quiet. The sound of the wind outside made the walls creak. But to them, it sounded like whispers from the world they were told to fear. Garrett's voice was the last they heard before sleep, reciting verses about endurance and faith. He reminded them that one day the earth would end, and only those who stayed pure would rise again. Joseph visited every few weeks. To the children, he was both familiar and distant. He brought bags of rice, candles, and tools. He rarely smiled, but he always bowed his head before Garrett, treating him like a prophet. Sometimes Joseph brought news, bits of stories about the weather or harvests, but he never mentioned people, never mentioned the outside world. He understood Garrett's rules. What came in stayed quiet, what went out disappeared. For the younger children, this life was all they knew. They did not dream of anything beyond the wooden walls. They played small games, arranging stones, whispering stories about angels. To them, the farm was the world, the sky, the trees beyond the fence, even the path leading away. Those were places of danger. They had been taught that if they ever crossed the gate, the devil would find them. Only Jan sometimes looked beyond. He began to notice things Garrett couldn't hide: the way sunlight reached the window cracks, the faint sound of cars passing far away, the marks of seasons on the trees. When Garrett grew weaker, coughing more, forgetting words, Jan started to feel something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. He wondered if maybe his father's end of the world had never come at all. He wondered if people were still out there, living, speaking, laughing. Once, when everyone slept, he dared to climb up to the hatch and lift it slightly. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp. He could smell rain, and in the distance, he saw the faint glow of lights from the village. The sight made his chest ache. He closed the hatch quietly, but the image stayed with him. As Garrett's health worsened, he spent more time in bed, his words weaker, his orders fewer. Joseph continued to visit, but Jan began to notice he looked nervous. Sometimes Joseph stayed outside longer than usual, checking the fence, listening for sounds. Jan asked where he went when he left the farm. Joseph only said, "Nowhere that matters." One evening, Garrett fell unconscious during prayer. The children tried to wake him, but he didn't respond. They waited for Joseph, who came days later. He gave Garrett medicine and said he would recover soon. But Jan felt something shift. The man who had once ruled every minute of their lives now lay helpless. The silence that had once been law began to feel like a cage. Days turned into weeks. Garrett slept more, spoke less. The others kept the same routine, afraid to change anything. Jan started to plan. He didn't know what he wanted, only that he had to see the world beyond the trees. He waited until Joseph left again, then gathered the courage to take a few coins from a drawer, wrapped himself in an old coat, and climbed the stairs. The night was cold. He pushed open the side door, and for the first time in 9 years, the air hit his face. The sky seemed too big. He could smell the grass, the soil, the faint scent of smoke from a chimney far away. He walked down the narrow path barefoot, his heart pounding, unsure if every step would bring him to freedom or punishment. Hours later, he saw lights ahead, the warm, soft glow of a window. He followed it through the fields and into the village. He didn't know the cafe's name or what he would say when he got there. He only knew he had to speak to someone who lived in the real world. That was how the quiet life of 9 years ended. With one man's doubt, one open door, and one long walk into the night. When the 6 children were brought into care, they did not speak for a long time. Doctors and police waited in quiet rooms, trying not to rush them, because everything about the world outside was new. The light, the smell of soap, the sound of doors closing. They looked around as if every detail was a puzzle to be solved. Even the ticking of a wall clock made them uneasy. One doctor later said, "They reacted to time itself, as if it was something dangerous." Each of them gave only a first name. No birthdays, no school records, no family files. When officers searched the Dutch National Register, they found nothing. It was as if these 6 people had never been born. The law called them unregistered citizens, but to the public, they became the children without names. Their true ages were estimated between 12 and 25, though each had claimed to be an adult. They had been taught to lie, to say they were over 18 in case they were discovered. It was their father's final rule: protect the family by denying childhood itself. Medical exams showed signs of long isolation. Their muscles were weak, their eyes sensitive to light. They were thin, but not starving. Physically, they had survived. Mentally, they had lived in a world no one else could see. Psychologists said they had what's called institutional syndrome, a kind of learned dependence where a person cannot act freely because their choices have always been made by someone else. Jan, the eldest, spoke first. He told investigators about the room under the floor, about the prayers, about Joseph bringing supplies. He said he loved his father, but also feared him. "We didn't know there were laws," he said. "Father said the outside was evil, that only we would be saved when the day came. We were waiting for a sign, but it never came." The younger ones said less. They used simple words. One said she thought everyone in the world had died, and only their family had survived. Another said she thought the sun was dangerous because her father told her its light was the eye of sin. When they were shown a photo of a city, full of people and cars, they looked frightened, almost offended, as if the image was a trick. For weeks, social workers tried to teach them ordinary things: how to eat at a table with others, how to use money, how to walk through streets without panic. They were placed in separate homes for protection and therapy. At night, some of them had nightmares, hearing their father's voice calling them back to the farm. One of the girls told her caregiver, "If he calls, I must answer. That's what he taught us." The Dutch authorities faced a legal puzzle. None of the children had identification. No birth certificates, no school history, no medical records. To give them official names, they had to prove who they were, but there were no documents to prove anything. So for months, they were registered under initials, A, B, C, letters instead of lives. Only later, after DNA tests confirmed their relation to Gerrit Jan van D, did the government create new records for them. For the first time in their lives, they became citizens, on paper and in law. Public reaction was divided. Some saw them as victims of madness, others as survivors of a strange faith. Reporters camped outside the hospital, hoping to glimpse one of them. But the authorities kept them hidden for their safety. A few locals from Ruinerwold organized prayers in the church, while others avoided talking about it altogether. In a small village, silence was easier than explanation. Investigators also contacted Gerrit's older daughters, 3 women who had left the family years before the isolation began. They confirmed that their father had grown more and more extreme after their mother's death. "He said the world was poisoned by lies," one daughter said. "When we refused to follow him, he said we were lost." None of them wanted contact with him again. In the notebooks found at the farm, police read pages of Gerrit's handwriting. Some entries described his daily routines. Others were filled with strange theology. "The children are pure. The outside burns with sin. We must stay hidden until the Lord reveals his day." Each note was dated but without a year, just day 142 or day 600. The last entry read simply, "Jan doubts, the devil is clever." Forensic experts also found financial records. Joseph had helped Gerrit move small sums of money through different accounts, mostly cash, mostly untraceable. It was enough to buy food, tools, and pay rent quietly. They concluded that Joseph was not just a helper. He was a partner who kept Gerrit's secret alive. In time, the younger children began to open up to therapists. They drew pictures of the house, of the cellar, of the garden. In those drawings, the sun was always small, far away, a pale circle behind clouds. One child drew the family sitting at the table, all facing Gerrit, no one facing each other. "We were not allowed to talk to one another during prayer," she explained. "If we looked at each other, Father said we shared weakness." The healing process was slow. When Jan visited his siblings under supervision, they greeted him with both joy and fear. To them, he was both brother and traitor, the one who had broken the rule and opened the door. He told them quietly, "You're safe now. No one will hurt you." But they still asked if the world outside would punish them for leaving. Meanwhile, Dutch society began to question itself. How could a family live in hiding for nearly a decade in such a small country, surrounded by systems meant to protect children? Newspapers called it a failure of sight. The mayor of Ruinerwold said publicly, "Sometimes the hardest thing to see is what stands behind a closed gate." Months later, each of the 6 was given an identity card. For the first time, they had birthdays, dates chosen after medical estimates. One of the social workers said the youngest cried when he received his. He thought it meant he was real, she said. But paperwork could not replace the years lost. The children had missed everything: school, friends, the smell of a city after rain, the idea of choice. They had to learn that rules could exist without fear, that authority did not always mean control. Some learned faster, some slower. Jan found part-time work in the north. One of his sisters began studying art, drawing what she called the House of Shadows. Still, when asked what they missed most, many gave the same answer: silence. Not because they loved it, but because it was the only thing they truly knew. Their father remained in the hospital, half paralyzed, unable to stand trial. Joseph was arrested and later charged with unlawful detention and abuse. But even as the courts prepared, Their case. The story of the children continued in quieter ways. Letters written, therapy sessions, attempts to live in a world that moved too fast. They were learning to speak freely, to ask questions without fear, to say no without punishment. And perhaps that was the real trial. The slow rebuilding of lives that had never been allowed to begin. The courtroom in Assen was full that morning. Journalists, officers, psychologists, and a few quiet villagers from Ruinerwold filled the benches. On the front row, the names of two men stood printed on white cards, Gerrit Jan van D. and Joseph B. Yet only one of them was present. Gerrit, the father, was too weak to stand trial. His body had failed before the law could reach him. He lay in a hospital ward, half paralyzed, unable to speak clearly or understand long sentences. The doctors said his mind drifted in and out, sometimes sharp, sometimes lost. So the case proceeded without him, his seat empty, his face shown only in photographs. Joseph B., the Austrian handyman who had kept the gate for 9 years, sat silently beside his lawyer. He wore a plain gray jacket, head slightly bowed, as if trying to disappear. To many, he looked like an ordinary man, polite, calm, even gentle. Yet the papers before the judge listed charges that sounded far from ordinary: unlawful detention, complicity in abuse, and money laundering. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. Outside, cameras clicked through the glass windows, trying to capture a glimpse of the man who had guarded a secret for almost a decade. The prosecutor began by describing the scene the police had found. The hatch, the dark room, the 6 children pale as ghosts. The audience listened in stillness. "These were not prisoners of steel bars," she said, "but of belief, fear, and obedience." Her voice was calm but firm. She spoke not of monsters, but of human beings who had chosen blindness, who believed control was salvation. Joseph's lawyer argued that his client had only followed instructions, that he thought the family's isolation was voluntary. "He repaired roofs, he brought food, he never locked any door," the lawyer said. "He saw faith, not captivity." But the prosecutor answered, "He saw enough to know something was wrong. He chose not to act." During the trial, investigators read Gerrit's diary entries aloud. The words filled the room like echoes from another world. "We must stay hidden. The children are the last pure ones. The world outside burns." Each line carried both devotion and madness, difficult to separate. Psychologists testified that Gerrit suffered from a delusional disorder, a religious fixation that turned into obsession. He believed he was chosen, one expert said, and his belief became a prison. None of the children appeared in court. They followed the case through their guardians and therapists. Some wrote letters that were read by their lawyers, short, simple messages, not of anger, but confusion. One wrote, "We want to understand why he thought this was love." Another wrote, "We are learning that being free is not a sin." Their words were soft but heavy. When Joseph was asked to speak, he rose slowly. "I did what I thought was right," he said in Dutch with an accent. "I never wanted to harm anyone. I believed the Father was doing God's work." The courtroom was silent. The judge looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Belief does not erase responsibility." In 2022, the verdict came. Gerrit was officially declared unfit to stand trial due to his health. Joseph was found guilty of unlawful detention and sentenced to 5 years in prison. For some, it felt too little. For others, it was all the law could do. Justice had come late and incomplete, as if even the courts could not fully open the locked room of that family's years. Outside, the village of Ruinerwold returned to its quiet life, though nothing was quite the same. The farmhouse on Buitenhuiserweg stood empty, its doors sealed, its windows covered. Grass grew over the path where Jan had walked that night. Locals avoided passing by after dark. Some said the place felt heavy, as if the air itself remembered. The 6 children, now adults by law, lived under protection in different parts of the country. They had new identities, new birthdays, new chances. Jan found a job in a small workshop in the north. One of his sisters took art classes and painted landscapes. Open fields, wide skies, and always a small figure walking toward the light. Another brother preferred silence, living near the sea, where the wind could drown the noise of memories. Psychologists said recovery would take years, maybe a lifetime. Isolation, they explained, rewires the mind. It teaches people to fear choice, to doubt every door that opens. The children learned slowly how to take a train, how to pay for groceries, how to trust a stranger's smile. They are learning to belong to a world that once terrified them, a therapist said. As months passed, the story faded from the headlines but stayed in the country's conscience. In schools and community centers, people talked about what it meant to see and not see. How could so many miss what was hidden in plain sight? How could an entire family live unseen in a nation known for order and care? The government promised reforms, better local reporting, stronger checks on isolated properties. But some said what truly failed was not the system, but attention. One newspaper wrote, "The gate was open. We just never looked inside." When journalists later visited Ruinerwold, they found the Café de Castelline still open. The owner, Chris Westerbeek, said little to reporters. He pointed to the corner table where Jan had sat that night and said, "He didn't look like someone dangerous. He looked like someone lost." Then he paused. Maybe that's what this whole story is. A long way of being lost. As for Garrett, he remained in care, silent, half-conscious. He sometimes murmured prayers, sometimes names no one recognized. The doctor said he no longer asked about his children. He stared at the window, where sunlight passed through the blinds in narrow lines, bright and thin, like the cracks in an old wall. In 2024, one of the children spoke publicly for the first time, in a short interview given anonymously. They said, "People ask what it felt like to be hidden. It's hard to explain. You don't feel trapped when you don't know freedom. You feel safe, and that's the danger. Freedom hurts at first, like light after darkness. But then you see colors you didn't know existed." That was the quiet truth behind the Ruinerwold case. It was never only about crime or madness. It was about faith turned inward, love turned into control, and a world that forgot to notice the silence behind a closed gate. Now, the farm stands empty, the grass grown high, the wind moving softly through the trees. No locks remain, only open doors and dust. But for those who lived inside, the real doors, the ones in their minds, will take far longer to open. And somewhere, in the middle of that silence, the story waits, not for judgment, but for understanding. When the Ruinerwold case reached its end, the Netherlands found itself divided, not by politics or law, but by disbelief. For months, television shows and radio programs filled with the same question. How could this happen here? A modern country, full of systems, technology, and care, yet a family lived locked away for 9 years without anyone noticing. It was more than a mystery. It was an accusation pointed at everyone. Politicians spoke of systemic blind spots. Experts blamed the lack of local oversight. But ordinary people, sitting in living rooms and cafes, felt something deeper. Shame. Ruinerwold had become a mirror, showing how silence and politeness could hide tragedy. Neighbors admitted they had seen small signs: the man who shopped alone, the lights that stayed dim, the empty path. Yet they had said nothing. "It wasn't our business," one villager confessed on camera. "Now I wish it had been." The debate grew louder. Commentators argued about faith, mental illness, and freedom. Some said Garrett was sick, others said he was evil. Religious leaders denounced the misuse of Scripture, warning how belief can twist when it leaves compassion behind. Psychologists spoke of control, disguised as love. Isolation, one said, is not faith. It's fear wearing holy clothes. For weeks, protests formed outside the courthouse. Some carried signs demanding justice for the children. Others demanded understanding, not vengeance. The air around the trial felt heavy, as if everyone was trying to measure guilt in a place where guilt was shared. A headline in De Volkskrant read, "A family hidden in faith, a nation hidden in habit." Across the country, the word Ruinerwold began to mean something larger than a village. It meant looking closer, at a quiet house at the end of a road, at a voice that doesn't answer, at a person who has slowly disappeared from sight. Schools used the story in ethics classes. Social workers reviewed hundreds of isolated households. For the first time, people began knocking on doors just to ask if everything was all right. In Ruinerwold itself, the farm remains fenced off, grass swallowing the path that once led to the cellar. But the silence around it has changed. What was once the sound of secrecy has become a warning. The locals still lower their voices when the story is mentioned, yet no one pretends it never happened. The name lives on, a reminder that darkness doesn't always hide in distant places. Sometimes it waits quietly behind walls we choose not to see. And if you listen closely to stories like this, true, strange, uncomfortable, you'll understand why they must be told. Because silence, left too long, becomes a second kind of prison. If you wish to hear more of these stories told with truth and care, stay with us. Subscribe and keep listening. Sometimes understanding begins where silence ends. Tell us where you watch from,